It's 105. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you all for joining us. I think it's just it's a little bit of a different meeting, this being technically our last meeting. So it's just wanted to kind of recognize all the effort and the input and everything that you have all contributed to this throughout the course of the last, I suppose it's been geez, a year and a half, if not more. So it'll be close to 2 years by the time this is adopted. So it's really a lot of effort, a lot of thought, and really detailed comments and time and energy from you all to get us here. So I also want to point out we had originally envisioned this being like no more than I think 6 different task force meetings, and we're now going through task force meeting number 8. So this was more than you had all signed up for, and I just want to say how much we all appreciate that and how important your efforts are to kind of shaping what's ultimately a work plan for the next 8 years, 6 to 8 years or so for the city. So it's quite a lot of work, and a lot of that work will continue and be implemented throughout for an ongoing basis. So really pretty significant moves that we're at least recommending here in this draft. So yeah, I just want to thank you all, and I think we can go ahead and get started. I think we all know each other at this point, so I guess if there's if anybody want to make some introductory comments, or if there's anything that folks want to share before we get started, please go ahead and raise your hand. But otherwise, let's just talk about the agenda, Kate. All right, so we're kind of doing a few greetings and announcements right now, but for the most part, we're going to jump right into talking through the minutes from the last 2 meetings. They're kind of we held them fairly in rapid succession back in February and early March of this year. So it seems like it was quite a while ago, but it was still those were our last meetings, believe it or not. So we have, as you might imagine, some public engagement to share with you that's occurred since then, and some input that we've received from the City Council, Planning Commission, and the general public through a survey and community forum that was held by the city. Then we'll get into the actual recommendations, which is really, this is the big, chunk of work that we're here to talk about, the draft HPS itself. So we finally arrived where, we have a draft of this to share with you, and that is, you're the first essentially to see this draft. So, we're going to be discussing it with the Planning Commission on Monday, but for the most part, this will be the first time we've discussed it. So we wanted to, talk about kind of where things have landed, at least for the time being, and whether or not we're comfortable with kind of the set of recommendations that we've landed on. And then I'll talk a little bit about kind of this, try to recap that discussion and talk a little bit about next steps for the project. So I will mention just one other thing. Casey, Sarah let us know that she wouldn't be able to be here today. So if you are able to lead sort of talking through the adoption of the minutes, that would be excellent.
All right. Then I will go ahead and motion to approve the minutes. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
I second.
All right, then maybe should we go with a visual here? All in favor, raise your hand so we can see you. And all opposed? All right, minutes are adopted.
Thanks for that, Casey. Appreciate that. I didn't see anybody raise their hands to oppose. I was trying to scroll through really quick here. So thanks for that. And yeah, I will go on and talk a little bit about what we've heard in the last few months from the public on our set of recommendations. So this is just kind of looking at the overall timeline and kind of where we started and where we are now. So again, really, not too far off from 2 years from when we began this work. And as you can see, we had originally envisioned only 6 meetings, and that has changed for the task force. But you can see that in general, we are near the end of this process, getting into the draft report, which will then take to again, the Planning Commission will kind of be able to look at this on Monday. Let us know if there are any sort of last bits of input that they want to incorporate before we go to public hearing, which we've scheduled for this coming September. So that's kind of where we are in the process, getting really close to that final stage, and we finally have this, at least a draft version of what we were ultimately tasked to produce here. Next slide.
She has a hand raised.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, John.
Quick question. Do we have any role in the public hearing?
We had Sarah come and provide some comments for the last time when the housing needs analysis went to a public hearing, but I think it would be really cool to see a larger group of folks, and I think even if only one or two of us is speaking, I think it would be great to see everybody come out. So that would be excellent, and I will give you information on that. But generally speaking, we're looking at, I believe it's September 5th for the first hearing at the Planning Commission. So that would be, something we can arrange to have somebody speak on behalf, or a few folks speak on behalf of the task force. But it'd be amazing if we could get everybody to show up and show support, or just kind of show, take some credit for what you've done and what you've produced here. Thanks, John. In terms of recent public engagement, I will just point out, in addition to those meetings that we held, mid-February and then very early of March, and we talked through some of those initial strategy recommendations through those 2 meetings. Shortly after, we held a community forum. Didn't get a ton of attendees there. I think a lot of people opted to instead fill out that online open house survey, which covered very similar content, but was kind of oriented towards folks that were not able to actually attend the forum and see the whole presentation. Regardless, though, we got about 134 responses to that survey. We had sort of results from the survey included in your packet, a little bit more detailed information for each question, as well as some of the qualitative input that we got from folks, the open-ended comments. So we had that open for about roughly 2 weeks or so, a little bit over 2 weeks, to allow for input. And 134 complete responses, in addition to the 15 folks that answered very similar questions at the community forum. We then kind of took the set of initial recommendations to the Planning Commission and City Council at a study session on April 2nd. So that was kind of a joint study session with both of those bodies, where we conducted some straw polling and got some input from each of those different groups separately, actually, even though they were both there. Got some input from each of them on what their opinions were on the overall set of recommended strategies, and some of those strategies that we identified required further discussion. Another thing that's happened since then, and I will say that after that study session, I've been out of the office for nearly 2 months, took some paternal leave. So I have just been back in the office for a little over, or I guess it's only been, less than 2 weeks at this point. So I'm fairly fresh back into the office. So this was new to me, at least recently, this letter from Habitat for Humanity that was sent to City Council and the Mayor on May 1st. And we'll talk a little bit about what their request was in just a moment. Next slide. So just kind of a overall summary. I don't want to get into every single question and the percentages for one way or the other, but this should give us a general sense of where things landed with that engagement. I think we've indicated the task force's overall opinions on things, but the survey and forum did include a general, sort of a general overarching question that we also posed to you all about, are you in favor of pro-housing policies in a broad sense? And there was, support from, obviously the task force, as well as folks that filled out the survey and forum. More specifically, though, you can see for each of the individual strategies, we received input. The task force provided their support for all of those, which is why they ended up as recommended strategies in the first place. And you can see that there were varying levels of support from the public for those strategies. I think, in particular, there was strong support for the accessible design incentives or mandate strategy, which is interesting to see. Folks were, it was a little bit more split when it comes to the TIF strategy there, to use that to support affordable housing. And yeah, you can just kind of see that there was general support, at least, if not more of like a 50-50 split when it comes to all of those different strategies that were recommended. You can also see that council was in favor of including all these recommended strategies, and we did again a vote on kind of this entire set of recommended strategies. It looks like the Planning Commission, there were two planning commissioners that were a bit concerned about the pre-approved plan sets for ADUs strategy, but overall that body did express support for the recommended strategies. Those were that was the one that I think a couple of commissioners wanted to talk a little bit more about. Next slide.
Eric, just so you know, you froze up. You've frozen up a couple of times, and it hasn't been a major disruption so far. But just so you're aware.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm not seeing that on my side. So.
All right. I'm assuming we're moving on.
Yeah. All right. So when it comes to the polling that we did for what we had identified as the strategies needing further discussion in that initial strategies memo, if you look at the kind of results here, for the most part, where we landed was the idea was to include basically just the multiple unit property tax exemption strategy from this list under the sort of criteria that it would only be available to housing with either accessible design features or that contained units that were affordable to families or households at 80 to 120% of AMI. So essentially affordable or accessible housing. There was some support from the task force for the zoning incentive strategy, but this is actually notable because it was the one strategy that the sort of general survey and general public expressed opposition to in any way. So this is the one sort of mildly opposed strategy, was that zoning incentives. Additionally, the City Council and the Planning Commission, for the most part, did not support including the strategy. When it comes to the CET, there was no interest at all from Council or the Planning Commission in that one. Not a single member of either of those bodies expressed support there, although we did hear some mild support from the public. We heard mild support from the public for the vertical housing development zone tax abatement as well, that strategy, but the task force actually opposed that one, and so did the Council and PC, so we did not recommend including it. And the other one that received some sort of interest from, some support from the survey and from the task force that was not included ultimately in the draft HPS is that pre-approved plan sets for middle housing typologies. So there really wasn't any interest from the Planning Commission or City Council in looking at that further. So we really try to take all of these recommendations into account, but ultimately, what we are going to be recommending will need to be approved by both the Planning Commission and City Council, or the Planning Commission will make a recommendation to City Council for ultimate approval. So we want to make sure that there is, general support for these the strategies that we are recommending here. Casey.
Yeah, just a quick question. I'm noticing that generally speaking, it looks like City Council and Planning Commission are pretty aligned on these, but is it in this case here where you've got the City Council already coming down as a no and the PC is saying yes, is it ultimately the PC that's determining whether or not it's going into the draft HPS, and then we're just waiting for City Council on whether or not they change their mind at that point? Or how are you weighing?
Yeah, I think ultimately, because there was a split and what we saw was like a 3-4 split in council, I think we wanted to discuss that further. I think we wanted to, we opted to include it in the draft HPS because that's what's already kind of out there, that's been publicized, but ultimately, City Council will make the ultimate decision. So there might be, some desire to, before we go to public hearing, do one thing or the other with that MUPD recommendation. But ultimately, I think given that 3 of the 4 bodies recommended, or 3 of the 4 sort of different sort of entities that we're looking at here, at least, as well as 3 of the 4 counselors, I think, or 3 of the 7 counselors rather, sorry. But given that there was, a little bit less of a strong sort of push either way, we are just going to include it in the draft HPS and then talk about it in a little bit more detail when we get to council to make sure that they're comfortable. And if not, then we will take it out. But yeah, I think for the most part, we did talk about the sort of multiple unit property tax exemption, which can kind of be shaped in different ways. So I think, it's sort of contingent on staff to come up with a little bit more of a specific idea for, just kind of making it clear that what we're talking about is MUPD specifically for accessible or affordable units, and kind of take the conversation from there. But that was a good question. I appreciate it. And good observation there that we didn't get full support from council on that, but did opt to include it. And we also had these other strategies, the contingent strategies that we called them, that were kind of dependent on a new funding source of some type. It looks like there was not interest from most bodies, but the Planning Commission and Council in particular weren't interested there. And we did not include the homebuyer opportunity limited tax exemption in the draft HPS. The Planning Commission and Council were in support of that recommendation, but we did get some new requests and sort of are looking at it from a bit of a different perspective here. So that's a pretty good segue actually into the next slide to talk a little bit about the letter that we received from Habitat for Humanity. And Rebecca, you had a question.
Yeah, I'd like to circle back, and maybe I apologize for not being at the last meeting. What was the outcome of the one to remove or reduce minimum parking requirements? Was there something that prevented us from?
That's a state mandated strategy that, there's support from council, but we did not, because it's a state mandated strategy, we haven't been, necessarily surveying folks within this context. We are going to be, we have been conducting engagement for that particular project, but it's something that we're required to do by the state. So that's kind of it's a sure bet in that capacity.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So just to talk a little bit about the strategy, which is one of, we kind of talked a little bit more generally about tax exemption and abatement strategies back in the fall when we were talking about just the general strategies that we could pursue for this project. And, this is one of those that we've included in that bundle. It specifically would offer, this is what we call HOLTE for short, or the Homebuyer Opportunity Limited Tax Exemption. It would offer a 10-year property tax exemption for lower income home buyers for units valued at no more than 120% of the city's median sales price. So it's based on the city's median sales price. So just kind of pointing out that in Lake Oswego, the way that that's structured, at least, that would allow this exemption to, in theory, apply to homes with values of up to $940,000, which is about 900 or 120% of the median sales price in the city, and that would be affordable to households earning up to $200,000 per year. So that's quite, that is what folks would consider not necessarily the most affordable type of housing. But there are options that I think we can tune this a little bit more finely and target different income levels if we wanted to with this. So that's just one thing to consider. And I guess just generally speaking, we got this letter from Habitat that was a request to consider this. So I think that's one thing to point out. We are just kind of reconsidering this because we do have a housing developer that's doing work here within the city, Habitat for Humanity, that has identified that this would be helpful for them, that this is something that they would be able to employ, particularly within the city in their project that they've been doing out on Boones Ferry Road. Just kind of something that they think would really help kind of catalyze affordable home ownership, and they're just kind of pointing out some of the various different benefits that they could see sort of from their nonprofit developer perspective. So it really, what it would do is reduce this property taxes for these folks that are buying the Habitat for Humanity townhomes. These are for sale townhouses, basically, that based on the Habitat for Humanity model are, being offered for, to lower income home buyers. So that's kind of their entire model. And if they're able to reduce those property taxes, then that means that, sort of a lower set of folks lower on the income spectrum can still afford those units by making them a couple $100s a month cheaper generally when it comes to property taxes. So, it's worth pointing out this would be an exemption for property tax on the value of improvements on the land. It's not necessarily the land, so there'd still be some property taxes, but for the most part, they would be significantly lower under this tax exemption for these home buyers. Brendan, Kate, Matt, is there anything that you wanted to add to this discussion here?
This is Kate. Sorry, I turned my camera off because it seemed like maybe my connection was a little bit wonky, and so hopefully that will help. Seems like it's been better since I turned it off. Anyway, yeah, I think Eric, you kind of already touched on this, but when we were thinking about the Holte abatement program, earlier in the process, I think we're really thinking of it in the sort of for-profit market realm. And our assessment was that given sort of property values in Lake Oswego, this program probably wouldn't be very effective in this community, but this is kind of a different way of
Kate
thinking about
mentioned
it. So definitely want to see if Brendan Buckley has any. Oh shoot, can you all hear me okay?
You cut out
Kate?
there for about 5 seconds, Kate.
But we
shoot.
heard you say, let's hear if Brendan has anything.
Yes. Great. I'll stop that.
Thank you. Yeah, so we kind of considered this from a different angle, and the letters and comments from Habitat for Humanity is, very, very interesting because they have a specific project that they're doing in town. Obviously, it's an example that this type of thing can happen. So through the HPS, we were talking about sort of low-income housing tax exemptions, but those are mostly for rental properties, and how to provide benefits for ownership opportunities has always been one of the trickier parts of affordable housing conversation, and their limited tools. So I think that this is a great concrete example of how that would be useful specifically for this type of program. And then we can, if we'd like to pursue this more, then certainly we can look at fine tuning the levels and so on so that they make sense. Perhaps make more sense than that 120%. But we'd be happy to do a little more analysis and look more deeply into that.
Yeah, I think, this is ultimately kind of a case of like, I think we made some assumptions that turned out, that essentially this could not have much of an impact in the city, where we were immediately presented with a situation where it would have an impact in the city. So we really wanted to kind of revisit that and have this discussion with you all. So yeah, we just kind of wanted to have this more broadly, but how do folks on the task force feel about potentially reintroducing this to the mix, considering kind of what we know now? It looks like we have a few questions in the chat as well. I can see if I can capture those. So Kristen originally had a question: would a rent to own type of program fall anywhere in here? Matt or Brendan, I'm not sure actually. I think maybe it could be covered, but I'm not necessarily I'm not sure about that one. Does anybody?
Unfortunately,
Yeah.
I do not know the answer to that. I don't know if you do, Brendan.
I don't know the technical answer if that's allowed. Usually with like a lease to own, it works like a rental, but if someone is getting the tax savings, presumably the nonprofit agency would be passing on the benefit of that to the leasee until they are able to to pay it off. So yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it would be worth looking into, I think. If there is some type of way that could be promoted in particular, for folks that are renting something to purchase it. But given the nature of this, like the subsidized nature of these units, it tends to be that the developer takes one tack or the other. I think for the most part, it's either they want to sell or they want to rent them. I think having kind of a mixture of those things might be more challenging, but it's something that we can definitely think through a little bit more. Let me know if you have any more follow-up questions on that, Kristen. I think it's something that we could definitely look into. Rosalie had a question as well, and then we'll get to you, Casey, if that's all right. Her question was any reason that Holte is available only for 3-bedroom places? Why not smaller places or more affordable places? I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think we're just using those as examples. For the most part, I think, yeah, it would not necessarily just be available for 3 or 4 bedroom homes, but that is kind of what you consider like to be a family size home. So that's kind of the examples that we're using here. Brendan or Matt, do you have anything else to
That's
add?
my understanding. I think these examples just came directly from Habitat for Humanity, and that those happen to be the sizes of units they're building in that project.
Yeah, so that would be what applies specifically to that project, I suppose. And for the habitat model, I think that's relatively common. But yeah, I think Kelly just pointed out, first of all, Pulte, I think the only place in this region that has adopted it, from what I understand at least, is in Portland. At least, as what Habitat described as within their footprint in this area. So yeah, it sounds like in Portland they do have 2-bedroom units that are eligible for Pulte if they're located in certain areas of the city. So just kind of gets at to the ability for the city to kind of structure this program in unique ways to address the needs that we're trying to meet here. Yeah, that was what she had indicated here in the comment. And with that, I'll go to Casey.
Thanks. I just want to clarify. It says that it's not recommended for inclusion at this time here, but are you still examining that? I mean, is this something that you're considering revisiting?
I think it was kind of when we made the HPS, we did not necessarily have this letter in mind, and so our original assumption was to, our original recommendation was to not include it. So that's what you have in this current draft of the HPS. But that doesn't mean that we can't modify that based on your input.
Got it. I think just as my general reaction to seeing it for the first time, it kind of probably is going to echo what Brendan was alluding to, which is maybe I have a different take on what qualifies as lower income and affordable at this point. When I do, roughly $1 million doesn't necessarily jump out, and I'm just wondering, before we took something like a letter like this seriously, if it would take some kind of analysis to figure out what is a more appropriate level here for these figures, and what would qualify then if we're considering homes that are almost $1 million in the neighborhood to qualify for this. Yeah,
that's a really good point there, Casey. I think when it comes to the specific Habitat for Humanity proposal, my understanding, I'll check on the actual levels of affordability there, but my understanding is that they're not at 120% of the city median. They don't use the city, I believe, as a median,
right?
Anyway, I believe for that particular incentive that they use for Habitat. But I will look into that really quick and try to get you a quick answer. I think it's at 80% of AMI, but I could be wrong. Just as like a barometer for what we do see here in the city, I think 80% is probably the sort of upper level of what has been sort of subsidized here in the city thus far. John.
Yes, since we have some new ideas here, I want to bring another thing up that sort of relates to this, and I think is simpler. When we first started these task force, one of the things we learned was that about 2,500 people come to town every week or every day to work, and that these are people, some of whom would like to live here but can't afford to live here. And I just would like to see something in our proposal. This would suggest that city workers, police, fire, emergency people, school district, school teachers, that kind of thing, would receive some help in helping them establish residency in our town, since almost none of them can afford to do it now. So that's one thing that I would like to see included at some point. But I understand it's maybe late in the process.
Yeah, I think there are ways that we could incentivize that. Maybe like ways that we could target certain things to sort of get at that recommendation. I do have some concerns about like whether or not that's legally something that we can do it, kind of like housing preference, I guess, to a degree for workers that live here. I think that might be okay, but I just would want to talk a little bit about the extent to which we can kind of take that tact. I don't know, Matt or Brendan, if you have any thoughts on that in particular.
I think it is potentially, so I'll use the word potentially to keep myself out of at least a certain amount of trouble, potentially possible to weave in those kind of eligibility or not eligibility, but preference criteria into a specific program. So I'm aware of other programs and communities where that kind of thing is done. So I think it is something that's possible, and it would be
Okay.
kind of woven into a specific program or a specific project. So you just
Yeah, I
can't,
mean, is there,
it can't be
sorry.
something where whatever that requirement is discriminates against a protected class and violates the Fair Housing Act. I mean, those are kind of the main things you just need to watch out for.
Of course, yeah. You wouldn't want to do that. I just
Yes. So as long
it's
as it's
just
structured that way.
there's some people who don't live here that if we do have a natural disaster, we need them here, and they aren't here, and we need to figure out a way to get them here. And one of the reasons is they can't afford it, and this would be a way to kind of get at that. And I think it could be used as a form of compensation that would be legal, but I certainly wouldn't want it to be discriminatory.
Yeah, I think in general there are certainly ways that we can get there. It sounds like, but I guess one question would be, do you see that there could be a potential to tie that to this program, or do you see that there could be, and if so, I'm not sure necessarily how that would sort of impact the Habitat project. But is there any other sort of strategy in particular that you think that this could be tied to, or maybe this is also a question for MIG and Johnson Economics as to if we know of any examples where
Well, I think
that type of
I think
preference
it
is tied
depends
to.
on how complicated it is. I think what you want is something that's not terribly complicated. And when I look at these proposals, I think, wow, that's going to be complicated. How are we going to administer that? And who's going to be responsible for that? Is it the owner, or is it there going to be a new branch of the city government to work on affordable housing for these? I mean, and a simple subsidy through their employment to get people who can't afford to live here, who are critical for our the health and well-being of our city. It seems to me to be a more direct and perhaps more effective way to do it. But that's okay. I'm done.
Well, that gets at some of the questions we're going to talk about later, and like maybe what are we missing here, and what is not sort of addressed by what we propose. So I think yeah, I appreciate that input. And I think maybe we could revisit it when we get there later. I do want to close the kind of loop on this Pulte conversation though. It sounds like folks might be comfortable with this if there was a stricter affordability requirement kind of attached to it than 120%, particularly considering that we're talking about the city median here and not the area median or something based on the county. So when we look at that, I mean, do folks resonate with that, I guess is the question.
Well, I guess my question, I'm sorry to bounce a question right back at you, is it says here that this is not expected to have a meaningful impact based on your initial read on it. Is that not the case, or do you feel that would change that read?
Yes, that's what we're kind of saying here, is that was our initial assumption, was that, oh, maybe this wouldn't work here, but we're kind of rethinking that at this point. So when we say not recommended here, we really just mean that it wasn't included in the draft HPS at that point, as a recommended strategy, but that we are recommending it. Well, I think we are recommending it at this point based on the fact that we do have a very tangible project that's like, saying to us right now, we could use this. I think a lot of what we've talked about is such that a lot of these incentives and strategies and a lot of the things that we could do as a city when it comes to housing, we kind of have to be opportunistic to a degree and kind of look at these opportunities that are presenting themselves that that might go contrary to what we assumed. I think the biggest kind of difference here is that we had looked at, potentially this being something that could be used for more like market rate type of developers that don't like specifically focus, for the most part, that don't focus on affordable housing, to get more into affordable housing, and seeing that might not actually make sense in those instances. But what we're looking at now is kind of, does it make sense for nonprofits who have this sort of specific orientation towards homeownership like Habitat? And I think we're finding that there's a different sort of calculation when you have a different type of developer that's a nonprofit at the table. I think that's probably the biggest, the quickest and easiest way to summarize it. But again, MIG or Brendan, please add or chime in as much as you can.
I would just try to. I would say all of these things, most of these things require a partner, either an affordable housing partner or
Right.
a market rate. And what we have here is a case where we have a partner saying we would use this, and so we're saying, well, then maybe we should rethink it. And so I think that's the shortest way I would try to kind of summarize why we're coming back to this. But I also see Rosalie's got her hand up.
Rosalie?
Oh, hi. What happens after 10 years? I mean, 10 years flies by. Do the homeowners all of a sudden have to pay a lot more?
I would say a lot of these projects that have a sort of a sunset period like that, project sponsor ends up asking for an extension or re-upping it, and that's what happens a lot of times. So I don't know about with this one in particular, but frequently that is the case. It's not for all of these strategies, but a lot of them that last for a certain amount of time, they can be essentially re-upped. And if the folks who are in those homes are still meeting the eligibility requirements and still benefiting, then that's often what happens. I can't guarantee that's what would happen here, but I do know that's frequently the case.
It just seems like there's always something hanging over you with regard to housing,
Mhm.
But
Well, and it's not necessarily a guarantee either, right? I think that when it is applied to nonprofits, you can have a little bit more certainty that it would be renewed in perpetuity. But it depends on how we craft the program, I think, there, and what we can do in terms of crafting the program. And I think maybe there are opportunities to look at applying this for to nonprofits in particular, but I'm not sure if we'd recommend that, but that could be a possibility.
And Eric, can I just jump in here real quick and just say, it's not the job of this task force to craft that program, right? It's should we look into this as a strategy, and then that work will come later. But we want to make sure that it's a strategy that is going to work for the city. And again, I think the initial hesitation was that this was, at 120% of the, median sale price. Well, that's a lot in Lake Oswego. But if we can tailor that and work on those criteria later, the question for this group is this something that you want us to look into further, the city to look into further as part of their strategy?
And obviously guidance on lower affordability levels in a general sense is absolutely appropriate. And we've included some criteria on those before, but we don't have to come up with everything for the program at all.
I think the purpose of these property tax abatements in part is that families that have these things are going to, over 10 years, are going to put themselves into a more solid economical position. I've had two relatives who have had these kinds of loans, and after 10 years, they do indeed start paying the same property taxes of other properties around them. But their incomes increased enough over the time that, and the abatement really helped them amass enough to afford regular property taxes. But that happens quite often. Once you're after 10 years, you have to jump in.
Yeah, I think ultimately there's a lot of opportunities for us to talk more about how we could craft this program once we have that draft HPS. And if we do end up recommending this, about different ways that we could incentivize it. Can we incentivize it for accessible units in particular? Can we incentivize it for home ownership that's being sort of offered by a nonprofit as opposed to a for-profit developer, that type of thing. We can have those conversations. I think, yeah, again, we're just looking like, is this something that you're interested in, or do you think that we were initially kind of on the right track with not really talking, recommending this initially, but do you think that that was kind of more where we should go, or do you think that this kind of lowering the 120% of median city median sales price would make a big difference in your opinion on this one?
Hey, Eric, I'm just looking at the clock and I'm wondering if it might be useful to take a quick straw poll. I feel like we've spent a lot of time
that's a great
talking
idea
about this, and maybe quick thumbs up, thumbs down kind of
Yeah.
straw.
Can you stop sharing your screen then, Kate, and we can try to see everybody? All right, well, let's do a straw poll, I guess. If you have any more questions about Holti, please let me know, but just know that we have, just whether this is the question, whether or not to include it in the draft HPS, or whether we'd recommend it for inclusion in the draft HPS, knowing that we have much more to talk about in terms of how it's crafted. So I guess raise your hands if you support it being included in the draft HPS. All right, so we have, okay, 1, 5, it looks like five hands are being raised here out of, geez, I should try to count all the folks that are voting members that are here. I guess Diana and Kristen, I don't know if you, yeah, I can't see you, I guess, so just if you want to let us know if you have one, you're kind of leaning one way or the other. It looks like we have at least 5. Phil, did you raise your hand before?
No.
No, okay, sorry. All right, so 5 of the 1. I think it might be an even split. Am I right about that?
I'm sorry, I should have put my hand up. I was away when you did this.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, all right. So I think 6 of the 10 of you that are here are in support of this. So we'll take that as a tentative recommendation based on the straw poll. But I guess I'll say, like, is there any input in particular that you want to include as to the affordability range here?
I guess I mean, obviously, I think the key categories that are thrown out as part of the letter are lower income and true need for affordable housing. And then another question I would love to have just here in terms, obviously this is early days and you haven't started the research on it, but if this is a meaningful tool that is implied, what would be, if any, the effect on tax revenues? How, if that's even relevant, like, is it a de minimis loss to the city to really go down this path, or is it worth noting? I would love to hear that.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that we would probably present if we were to bring it forth to, the actual proposal. But what we're looking at here, at least with the Habitat for Humanity project, I will mention those units are going to be between 35 to 80% of regional AMI. So that's kind of what that specific project would entail. I believe there's 15 units at that project. And so, what we're talking about is a couple $100 per each unit potentially at most when it comes to this particular project that we're envisioning it for. And there's a lot more research that we'd have to do in terms of where else it could be applied. So hopefully that's at least like some broad answer, but I think de minimis is probably closer to the reality than not. But yeah, it looks like we have another question, John. Or are you're just raising your hand from before still? All right. Yeah, so I guess we'll move forward. Let's go on. I'll hand it over to Kate and let's talk about the draft HPS and just kind of where we landed and other questions that we want to talk about with you before we make an official recommendation from the task force.
All right, thanks, Eric. And I'm hoping that you all will continue to hear me talk, if not see me. And I'm going to count on Matt to let me know, maybe via text, if somehow I'm breaking up a whole lot, and we'll go from there.
Okay.
So yeah, we wanted to give kind of a brief overview of the HPS that you all received in your packet. A lot of it is material that, you know, and content you've already seen, and we've talked about all of these strategies at previous task force meetings. But just kind of wanted to give you an overview of what's in there, and then get your input on what's there and potentially what you think might be missing. So so just to give you a preview of the questions that we'd like to discuss as we talk through this. For one thing, some of the strategies, we've included specific recommendations that we hadn't yet identified in earlier memos and products. So just wanted to make sure that you are supportive of those specific recommendations. Looking at the implementation timeline, is that reasonable based on sort of the level of effort that's needed for these various strategies and sort of the relative priority of each of those strategies? Are there any considerations for implementation of these strategies that you think haven't yet been captured in the report that you think should be included? And then given sort of the totality of all the strategies and, you know, the housing needs that we've identified, do you think anything major is missing? So with those in mind, we're going to go through each of these sets of strategies. Again, we're not going to get into the details here in the presentation, but just to kind of remind you of what's in the draft HPS. And we've done a bit of a reorganization here to kind of categorize the strategies based on the overall housing need that's being met by the primary need that would be met by the strategies. So the first category is sort of overall housing production and supply. So these are strategies that you know, meet the overall long-term need. There's an identified need for, you know, a certain number of units at a various range of affordability or income levels, and these strategies kind of work generally towards that need. So we have the code audit and amendments strategy. Removing and reducing parking requirements. As Erik described, that's a state mandated requirement for the city to undertake in some form. And then we have rezoning land. So within this category, for the rezoning land strategy, there is a specific recommendation there, which is to prioritize rezoning in areas with really the greatest potential for higher density multifamily housing. So those in particular would be areas where non-residential uses are currently allowed, but they're really underutilized. So maybe there's a lot of vacant land or buildings that are vacant or are not being really used. So those would be areas that we would recommend the city kind of look to first. And so some potential zoning districts that could be considered for this strategy are industrial district. So, and also we included in the report that we could also think about this strategy not only as actually rezoning, changing the zoning designations of certain areas, but also thinking about making major changes to the types of uses that are permitted. So, for example, in some of these districts where residential uses currently aren't allowed, we could consider adding those as allowed uses, which would be kind of similar to a rezoning kind of approach. So just want to get a general sense of your support for this specific recommendation, and if you have any other things for us to consider.
Yeah, I guess I'd point out this is a pretty big one that is very like nebulous now and will be refined with extensive community engagement. The you know, comments that we've received earlier about making sure that any strategy that we look at is more, you know, is sensitive to neighborhood context and character. That's you know, something that we try to overlay on every single project that we do here, but I think would be particularly you know, very acute importance when it comes to potential rezonings. You know, kind of thinking just kind of pointing out where you cut out just very briefly, Kate. Just some of the zoning districts that we could consider are the mixed commerce district, the MC or industrial district that are listed here on the page. But this could look, you know, this could look like many different things. We do have some sort of active proposals from the private sector for rezoning right now that are looking at, you know, basically moving from and basically on a Stafford Road property to increase the density on that site to allow for multifamily use. So yeah, this could take many different flavors and forms, I guess, is the overall kind of point I'm trying to make here. And that it will be heavily discussed, when this goes through, and we'll have its own kind of public review process for each of the different rezonings that could be considered for the strategy.
Is this thing tied at all to transportation issues? Or is that a whole separate thing?
Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
Mass transit, adding mass transit to this, or is it dealt with elsewhere in this document?
Well, that is a bit beyond the scope of what we're looking at for this project. I think there is a lot of regional conversations about potential kind of max line type of extensions and things of that nature, but certainly kind of outside the scope of what we're talking about here. We do have transit, we have bus lines in the city, and a lot of in particular, that climate friendly and equitable communities parking reform work that is required of us by the state responds very directly to what we've identified as transit corridors and town centers in the metro regional growth concept. So this is all kind of to say, though, that anywhere where we currently have like commercial mixed use or multifamily zoning tends to be very responsive to this sort of idea of town centers, which are basically part of that sort of larger regional transit strategy, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity to consider this when we look at potential places for rezoning. Where is there the most access to different types of transportation, and where is that a little bit more possible within the city, and that would make sense for something like multifamily. I will say, though, we also did, throughout the work that we did on the housing needs analysis, looking at our needs, we did identify that there's a need for multifamily even outside of those town centers that could be in strategic locations. So it's certainly a hugely important thing to overlay onto the conversation of where rezoning could happen.
Excuse me, where does the utility infrastructure for each of these recommendations fit into the bigger picture?
That's another good point. I think that's always something that needs to be considered with any individual rezoning project is what is the infrastructure capable of doing in that particular area, and what can we support. Those could be either public investments or investments from the private side. So I think we actually did discuss that as a strategy back in the fall and talk a little bit about infrastructure investments specifically to support housing. And did not hear a ton of support for that to be included in the housing production strategy. I think the general thought was, and I'm speaking very broadly, and kind of planning commission, council, task force, and the public, but just my sort of recollection is that the general thought was that we sort of do that work already in terms of transit and sort of transportation planning for well, just infrastructure in general. I will say that we do a lot of infrastructure planning in general on that. It wouldn't necessarily be the most helpful thing to look at it as an individual housing production strategy.
I was thinking, what jumped out at me was the new sewer plant, for example. And if we're talking about adding over the course of time 25 new units, was it set up for that?
Right. Yeah, I think the answer is, generally speaking, we wouldn't be able to do a rezoning if we didn't have the infrastructure capacity to do that. And so that's something that we would analyze for any individual like rezoning proposal. And if we didn't have the infrastructure, there would need to be a sort of commitment to provide it, again, from the public or private side, depending on the situation.
Thank you.
Generally, those types of large scale facilities are designed and planned to be able to support growth over the long term. So a development or a smaller rezone, unless it's really exceeding what that projected long-term growth is not going to sort of trigger, oh, we can't serve this with our treatment plan or something of that nature. And Eric's right, anytime you're going through this, you do have to look at, for the specific rezone, do you have the capacity to serve it? So.
John.
Well, sort of ancillary to that is that many of the unincorporated areas of Lake Oswego, the most affordable housing, are having problems with infrastructure like sewer, but it's very expensive. So we give them a bill for connecting sewer, which is remarkable. I mean, it's not a cheap thing to do, and it makes their house less affordable for them. So some way to look at infrastructure extension into the more affordable areas of the unincorporated area, with the idea maybe of bringing them in, might be a way to include more affordable housing within our boundaries.
Appreciate that. I will also remind folks that we did analyze that strategy as well back in the fall of trying to come up with some type of housing sort of a strategy for those unincorporated areas, and how we would sort of handle those within the city, and whether there'd be maybe some minimum density requirements for those annexations. And we did try to vet that with folks, and there wasn't much interest at that point. But your point is well taken nonetheless, John. I do think that when we talk about rezoning, we aren't. I think it's worth pointing out we're not specifically talking about annexing areas and providing them with city zoning, although that is a possibility. But when we talk about rezoning, we generally talk about what's already within the city, and sort of modifying what's either allowed there or how much you can have of it.
Sure.
Just to kind of come full circle on that. But again, I appreciate your comment. Kate, I guess we can probably go on to the next slide.
Yeah, not hearing any major concerns with these recommendations. So the next set of strategies is around housing choices. So making sure that, housing production really meets a broad range of housing needs and preferences. And this includes things like, a range of housing types and sizes, and housing to meet certain needs for folks to age in place, for accessibility, things like that. So the strategies under this category include evaluating accessible design, either incentives or mandates, evaluating the MUPD, the multiple unit property tax exemption, pre-approved plan sets for ADUs, and modifying system development charge fee schedules to kind of incentivize or support smaller development of smaller housing units. So within this set of strategies, we had a specific recommendation related to the MUPD, which Erik kind of already touched on. This was the recommendation that came out of the Planning Commission and City Council meeting, was to evaluate adoption of the MUPD. So not necessarily committing to adopting it necessarily. We need to do a little more analysis here, but specifically considering the criteria of either making it available to accessible units or requiring accessible design, which is kind of in support of the strategy focusing specifically on accessible design, or focusing the MUPD program on moderate income units. So in that 80 to 120% area median income. Again, that's the Clackamas County area, so not just within Lake Oswego. So kind of looking at a broader range of incomes. So this was the recommendation from Planning Commission and City Council. Just wanted to get your thoughts. Do you agree with this recommendation? Do you have any other concerns about it or any other suggestions?
I saw something that you presented earlier. Can you go back one slide? Did I see something earlier that on number 6, that 2 people on the Planning Commission said that they weren't in favor of this at all?
I think it was more, you are correct that there were 2 folks on the Planning Commission that did not support that strategy, or at least did not support the entire set of recommended strategies, and had desire to talk, I think, a little bit more about that pre-approved plan sets for ADUs. So I think, that's probably how I would categorize it, but that is more or less accurate. And we do have a member of the Planning Commission here that can maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Hey, John, this is Philip. I'll turn my video back on. I was having a little bit of trouble with the reception as well. Yeah, so I was actually one of the planning commission members that voted against this, and it mainly had to do with not necessarily the idea of pre-approved plan sets as much as just uncertainty about the process, and I didn't really see a clear way of successfully implementing it here. So I think I mean, for me, it's something that I'd like to dig into a little bit more before I'm really comfortable with it. But that was just my particular opinion. I don't remember what the reason was for the other commissioner voting against it.
Is that what's driving it so far out, like to 2028? That kind of surprised me.
Well, I think part of it, the reason why it goes out that far, and Eric, you probably would agree with this, is that, you know, it would be more short term if we were able to go out and find pre-approved plan sets that are already done and could work here, but that's not likely, just given we've got a lot of land, you know, we have a lot of grade change, we have a lot of hills and things like that, and it makes sort of a pre-approved plan difficult to implement, you know, unless you have flat ground. So what takes longer, I think, is just we would have to go through the process of having them commissioned, created, approved, and that just takes time.
Okay.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You know, I think I would point out that we had initially said that this would be kind of a longer term. I think we had categorized it as a longer term project and had actually modified that based on your input for the draft housing production strategy to be medium term, just to respond to some of what you had said, Rebecca. But so yeah, looking you know, at much less than 8 years for that. But yeah, you know, I think that certainly when you think about how this project could play out, you know, one of the ways that we could really get a great result here, and something that we felt was really representative of what we want to see in the community, is if we, you know, partnered with like a university, or maybe did like a design competition of some type where you know, it would be I think this is something that process is beneficial to. You don't just kind of want to have this like out of the box thing that you're kind of just saying that you can go and kind of replicate all throughout the city. I think it requires some community buy-in. And I think that's kind of the idea of you know, why we'd want to spend a little bit more time up front on that. I think the actual implementation of it could be less tricky, but that just like coming up with something that we feel is kind of representative of what we want to see in the city is a pretty big discussion, I think. So yeah, that was kind of a little bit of a thought process there. And yeah, I think you know, we're not sure it would have the most immediate impact, but you know, we certainly are open to the idea that we might be wrong about that, as we, you know, have been kind of open to the idea of reconsidering the whole T, et cetera.
Are you familiar with Cole Peterson of Portland, ADU builder, teacher, all the real estate agents and such, and does the things for Energy Trust, has plans and code information?
I'm generally
KOL
familiar,
Peterson.
but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Yeah, so that's, yeah, I think you know, the pre-approved plan sets for ADUs is something that we do intend to have a little bit more discussion at the planning commission about it. But ultimately they did recommend moving forward with it, you know, 3 of the 5 at least. So but that doesn't mean that we don't want to, you know, try to make, you know, to address the concerns that are being brought up by Commissioner Stewart and others. So Rosalie just said, or you can just order a $15,000 tiny home off of Amazon. Yeah, those are yeah, those are different in the city, and they're not always something that for the most part we they would need to be like permanent for the most part to be allowed in Lake Oswego for tiny homes. So it's kind of not usually what you think of when you think of a tiny home. But that's a good point.
Okay. Just so you know, the plans, they also have the builders that have, you know, make it for the individual lots I don't have much deeper information, but they have free online site there too, and you can take a look at that. If you just put in Cole Peterson, if you don't already know him, you can
Sure.
get more information because they have 350 to 1100 square feet plans and codes and things, and they're not like just the canned Amazon ones.
Yeah, I think that's going to be important for something that the city will be like putting its stamp on. That we won't necessarily want to go with something completely, maybe we will, but we want to make sure that even if it's prefab, that it's completely sort of responsive to the context and a high quality design product, I think so. And I think sustainability features, as you mentioned, is something that I'm sure will be a part of that conversation. So all right, so we were talking a
Do we
bit
want to
about
switch gears back to the MUPD question? Yeah, just sorry, I think I might have cut out there for a second. Just wanted to see if there were any other thoughts about the MUPD and whether this group is comfortable with this recommendation that was made by the Planning Commission and City Council on this strategy. Or I haven't heard any concerns.
I mean, I think it was also a recommendation from them, from the task force as well. So I guess this is also like, did we capture your kind of thinking, when we talked about this with you last? And if I'm hearing nothing, then I assume that folks are comfortable.
Okay, great. So then the next set of strategies is specific to affordable housing for lower income households. So this is the kind of section of the HPS with the most strategies. We have 5 targeted to affordable housing, including one that's actually already been adopted by City Council. The nonprofit low income housing tax exemption was approved a few months ago, I think, and that was specifically
another update, yeah.
yeah. So that's already in place. That was requested by another, affordable housing builder that's working in Lake Oswego now. And we are also including the low income rental housing tax exemption, which has a somewhat different structure and is a little bit more flexible than the nonprofit exemption. The public-private partnerships for affordable housing, which is kind of includes a range of strategies and actions that the city could take in partnership with other organizations, using tax increment financing to support affordable housing, and then conducting an inventory of existing affordable housing in the city. So we have a couple strategies with some specific recommendations here. So again, for the low-income rental housing tax exemption, we are recommending this as kind of an additional program that would kind of supplement the already adopted nonprofit housing tax exemption. Again, the low-income exemption strategy number 9 is available not only to nonprofit builders, but also to for-profit builders, which isn't typically sort of who you think of as building affordable housing, but it actually is. We were talking to another jurisdiction recently, and they're actually seeing more development by for-profit builders of affordable housing in their community than they are by nonprofit builders, which was a little bit surprising to me, but I guess there are, for-profit companies out there that are making it work financially to build that type of housing. So this would be, an incentive for that type of development as well in the city. So are there any concerns with including that recommendation?
Here.
Yeah. Did you want to say something, Jack?
No, I just said it's okay here. I agree with that.
You agree? Okay, great.
Okay. Great. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Yeah, again, this is kind of one of the things that we discussed with you previously as being a recommended strategy. So I don't think we heard much opposition previously.
All right. Moving on to the next one. So we included kind of a more specific list under the partnership strategy of things that we would recommend the city kind of consider for ways to support affordable housing development. So one is donating surplus city-owned land as it becomes available. Working with faith-based organizations to use their excess or underutilized land for affordable housing. And this is something that the city is already doing by supporting the Mercy Greenbrae housing development that's currently is, I don't know if it's completed yet, Eric, but I know it's at least under construction.
I think still under construction, but yeah, it's getting close. Although I want to say there was some type of ribbon cutting, but I'm not sure exactly what that signified. But yeah, I don't think that there's occupancy yet.
Okay, so still underway.
No,
Continuing
there is
to,
occupancy. I just want to clarify. Mercy Green Bay, they do have families living there. The official grand opening, I think, is on the 21st of, or no, later this month. Yeah, I think it's, I can't remember the date, but yes, they're open.
Another update. Thank you, Jessica. They're officially open, not just, you know, the ribbon hasn't just been cut.
that's awesome. Great to hear. Another one is just leveraging, you know, funding sources from outside of the city, so federal, state, and regional resources. And we've actually heard that there's, and have been learning that there's more and more funding available from the state of Oregon than there was before to support affordable housing development. So lots of opportunities there. And then using, you know, really focusing partnership strategies within a new potential TIF district or tax increment financing urban renewal district, which is something we'll talk about in just a moment. And before I move on, let's see, I think Rebecca had a hand up and then John.
Yeah, so in these discussions, is anybody bringing up like HUD or Section 8 or RD type government subsidized, or is this something outside of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think any builders that any nonprofit housing developers are looking at utilizing all of those types of funding opportunities. Also, low income housing tax credits are a very common source of funding for affordable housing.
Sure.
So
I guess it kind of raises a flag with me when I see the government subsidized, just because I have a relative who manages government subsidized properties, and there's a big difference between a HUD property and an R&D property as far as restrictions and what you're locked into when you start opening up properties for that. I mean, there are some real tough hardships that can occur. And if we implement this, but don't talk about exactly what it will look like, and it turns into some sort of like an R&D type property, it could be hard to dial it back, and it could be a real hardship. I mean, there are a lot of restrictions, there are a lot of requirements, and there are a lot of downsides to when you open up those programs. For example, you have to have a certain income level for a HUD or an R&D, but if you move into a property and your income drops to zero, there's no restriction. You under the R&D, you have rights. You can't be moved off the property. You can have people moving in and out, and it becomes, according to my relative, it can be a real management nightmare. So I didn't know if we were wrapping something around this when we're presenting it, or if it's just kind of like, okay, go for it, and somebody else is going to make those decisions, because I could see that being, like I said, a red flag.
And you're saying HUD, and what is the other term that you're using?
The RD, the rural development. It's kind of like HUD, but it's got a lot more. It's a lot harder to manage, and again, the person I know manages both types, and she says with HUD they're in partnership with the owners, or in partnership with the renters, or the renters if it's a rental, and a lot more just checking in, making sure they're meeting requirements, making sure it's being managed well. With the R&D properties, they're finding a lot more violations that people aren't held accountable for, people whose income dropped to zero, and they're not required to look for employment or bring in the income, and they're bringing in other people, and there's a lot more flexibility allowing them to bring in roommates, and it's causing a lot of commotion in the areas where this sort of housing is going on. So I didn't know, again, there's a lot more detail to it than I got conversations, but I want to know, where are we opening ourselves up, or do we have something that we're kind of building around it?
I don't think that that's addressed here, Rebecca. When we talk about federal resources, we're not talking about like the federal government coming in and being the like manager of
Okay,
property.
it said government subsidized. Okay, all right.
Yeah, government subsidized is how we funded and how almost every single affordable housing project needs to be funded more or less when it comes to tax credits and things of that nature. And there's a
Okay.
lot of that subsidy that nonprofits can get from the federal government that aren't necessarily requiring the federal government to take an active role in the management of the property.
Okay,
Um,
good, good. That's
and
what
so
I'm-
I guess I think that I just point that out, that we're not necessarily recommending that we hand this over to the feds if that's kind of your concern.
Okay, thank you.
John. It looks like you're muted still.
Yeah, I was muted. I'm sorry. So I'm looking at this and I'm looking at donated city-owned land, surplus city-owned land. Could you give me some examples of surplus city-owned land?
Absolutely. A great example of that is the project that's going on Boones Ferry Road with Hacienda. Essentially, that was a site that the city had used for staging for construction that was occurring on Boones Ferry Road. That all that construction that occurred, 5 or so years ago, I guess, on Boones Ferry, there was a site that the city owned and held that was used for just sort of staging equipment and doing for that construction that was then donated to. I guess we donated it to or disposed of it to Metro, and then they ended up kind of working with Hacienda for the affordable housing development there. So that is one example of that what that looks like.
Well, it wasn't donated,
So
Eric.
you're
I just
not
want to clarify.
you're not
is disposed of, yeah. So.
Yeah, it was sold to Metro, but
Right.
specifically for the purposes of affordable housing.
right. Hello?
Yeah, and I would just add that in general, that is a really effective strategy to be able to provide land at low to no cost, or I guess no to low cost, because it really improves the financial feasibility of an affordable housing project. So it's pretty commonly recommended as at least one kind of strategy to use to support those kind of developments.
Because the city owns a lot of property that are currently designated as parks and recreation facilities, and you're not talking about any of those.
No, we're not talking
Would you
about
be
that.
talking about?
No.
Would you be considering surplus land, for instance, at the headwaters, or not the headwaters, but the confluence of the Willamette River and Tryon Creek, where we own a substantial amount of property and have not developed it as a park, but we still own it, and it's north of the city, so it would have less traffic impact. Would that be considered surplus?
If it is planned or used for a natural resource or open space or park, I don't think that's typically what we're talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the city is not proposing to dispose of any parks properties or anything that's used for some other city function currently. It would just be the surplus land that we would use for this.
Okay.
And we would not define that to include anything that's being actively utilized as a park or public facility or institution of some kind. That's not covered by the strategy. And another thing to look at here is this is really what we're talking about is public-private partnerships. So that's one way that the city could contribute to that type of structure, but it's not the only way. So really, again, the city does need to be somewhat opportunistic here, but in order to kind of work with the momentum that's out there and kind of leverage that. But we do so there are limited things that the city can do on its own. But kind of what we're talking about here is when opportunities do arise to take those actions that could support the affordable housing.
Right. Let's move on to the next one, which is the TIF strategy. So using tax increment financing to support affordable housing. So the recommendation here is to incorporate affordable housing into the plans for the a new urban renewal district in the Foothills neighborhood. And this is something that the Lake Oswego Redevelopment Authority or agency has sort of already started to discuss and move forward with. And they're planning to, as a first step, to update the what's called the Foothills Refinement Plan. It's kind of a long-range plan for that specific neighborhood. And then after that, it would be designated as a new urban renewal district. And in order for affordable housing to really be included in the plans for that area, it would need to be included as what's called an approved project in the urban renewal plan. And then it would become eligible for the TIF funding. So that would be the recommendation there, is to kind of specifically include affordable housing in the plans for that new TIF district. So any concern, and that's something that I think the city is already kind of moving forward with and would be starting on in the nearer term, but it's kind of ultimately a longer term strategy for implementation, because it would take several years to go through that planning process and the development of not only the refinement plan, but also the urban renewal plan itself, and to get that approved.
Yeah, I think, we just kind of, in order to make this happen, we would have to, as a part of the, refinement plan or in the urban renewal plan itself, have it, specifically called out as project, affordable housing. So that would be kind of what we're talking about here, is not just TIF, but the inclusion of affordable housing and TIF as a project.
And I know this was a strategy that was recommended by the task force previously, so not seeing any concerns with that, so that's great. All right, and then just to call out sort of the last category, this is sort of the other category that so fair housing policy and education didn't really fit under the other categories that we'd identified for the HPS, but it is an important strategy, and it does really kind of support implementation of all the other recommended housing strategies. And it's kind of a general approach to including this as a policy within the comprehensive plan. So kind of the city committing to fair housing as a goal, and then also committing to sort of educating the community and educating decision makers and staff and folks involved in real estate about fair housing issues, and making sure folks can identify fair housing concerns and things like that. And there's no specific questions about that one, just wanted to make sure you all are aware of it. And then moving on to the implementation timeline. So this is kind of what we are starting with in terms of where the city will sort of start implementation and expects to have the various strategies completed. And just wanted to get your take on, based on what you are aware of with these strategies and, the priorities for the city, and sort of the level of effort and investment that these will all take. Does this timeline seem to make sense? Does anything look amiss here? And this is kind of the timeline between from now to the next time that the city will have to undertake a new housing production strategy based on state law.
And as you can see, with the SDCs in particular, we do anticipate some near-term action, specifically updating SDCs for cottage clusters, but also would anticipate longer-term action for more broad updates to the SDC methodology. So that's why it's kind of split up there.
And so one more thing, is number 2 here, reduce or remove or reduce minimum parking requirements? That's because this requires that to be a part of this?
It's required by the state, and it is something that is a possible strategy to increase housing production. So we're opting to recommend including it in our housing production strategy, because we'd like to take credit for what we're required to do otherwise for other types of work. But considering that it's happening, I think we just want to be able to include it here. And as you can see, that's something we anticipate happening before the end of the year, as required.
I would imagine that some of the local neighborhood associations would have things to say about that, but they've had plenty of chance, haven't they?
Yeah, and again, it's a mandate, and there really isn't much. There aren't many options for the city that would kind of assuage some of the concerns that folks might have. But yeah, it is a separate project. I know that there's a lot of interest in it, but at least when it comes to this conversation, it seems to be kind of a magnet. But I will say that it is something that kind of necessitates digging into a little bit before it sort of, you can see that connection between the housing production side of it and the reduction of minimum parking requirements. But I think ultimately, yeah, we have seen support from City Council and some folks on the Planning Commission, and there are some areas where we're seeing the public that particularly smaller businesses, we're hearing some support for this. Casey.
I just wanted to follow up on that. Have you synced at all with like the Transportation Advisory Board on this particular one? Is there anything at all where that could be helpful from our board in terms of this step, given that it is so short term? Anything to get out in front of?
Well, I'll be giving a presentation to the Transportation Advisory Board, but in July, at your meeting in July. So Will has me on the schedule there. I will say though that there really isn't much room for input, so it's kind of just like an informational, informational kind of presentation on what we're tasked to do by the city and kind of what we've been. It's kind of where that's been headed in terms of the public conversation, but yeah, kind of right now we're in the process of writing those code amendments, getting the drafts out there, and we'll kind of take those to the Planning Commission and discuss those with you at TAB prior to going to any public hearing on that.
Great, thanks.
So yes, that is, we have a whole website and informational materials on that, and yeah, I can definitely provide those to folks. But yeah, suffice to say, it is required, and so we just want to make sure that we don't leave it out of here, because it will. We do expect that will have a tangible impact on housing. All right, I'm hearing not much about the specifics of the timeline, at least. As you can imagine, some of these are bigger projects than others. Excuse me. Rezoning is another one that actually technically we could think of as like there is opportunity for near-term action that we expect to receive some private applications for rezoning in the near term, as well as kind of the sort of city-led effort that we're talking about with this strategy that would take place starting about 2027 is what we're looking at here. So just kind of pointing out that these things they're not necessarily as cut and dry as you might see in the schedule here. Something like the nonprofit housing exemption, just because we've implemented it doesn't mean it's over. We're going to have to continue applying that. It's something that needs to be renewed, and it will be effective moving forward. So it's something that we have adopted, but there's still work to do to kind of enact that moving forward. So it's not over.
All right, I think the last slide here is just going back to our discussion questions. Is there anything that we haven't already discussed that you think should be captured in the housing production strategy related to implementation of any of these strategies? And do you think anything glaring is missing? Other than the Holte program, which it sounds like we're going to recommend to the Planning Commission and City Council that be considered further for inclusion in the HPS.
Yeah, I think we'll put that forward as like an evaluate Holte kind of recommendation, similar to what we have for some of these other strategies.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know John, you had mentioned earlier something related to kind of folks that work in the city and trying to have some more direct connection between the housing that's being produced and the folks that are working here that can't afford to live here. So that's something that has been noted. Rosalie.
I guess the only thing I see missing, and for some reason people are afraid to talk about it. I just think the whole reason all this housing stuff became necessary to talk about and have plans and meetings and visions is because people were having a hard time keeping themselves housed more and more. Maybe they could stay housed, but they would have to give up something else, like their child's education or that one medicine that make them feel a little better. I just think that if we're going to talk about housing, we should talk about more renter protections and maybe some limits on rent increases. That would keep people housed and it would make people happier. Maybe not the landlord, but I think they get used to it. And from what I understand, I think it was like 5 or 6 years ago, I attended a meeting in Lake Oswego City Hall. It was about how there were so many people in Lake Oswego who were considered rent burdened, which they were paying more than 30% of their income in rent. They were paying not only that, but more than half of their income in rent. And I don't think we talk enough about that. I mean, we talk about, well, I guess that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Rosalie. I appreciate that. You know, I think that's something that we tend to stress a lot more in our presentations to folks that haven't been through this whole process with us, that didn't go through the kind of development of the housing needs analysis and the discussion of that. But that's something that I do try to stress it when I do make sort of presentations that are trying to capture the totality of what we're talking about here and where this is all coming from. But yeah, I appreciate that kind of need to kind of remind ourselves of what we're doing here and why we're doing it, and that there is an acute need for housing, and that, you know, it is extremely expensive to get housing in Lake Oswego, to find that housing. And so a lot of folks that are already living here are completely spending way more than they should be on their housing, just due to, to be able to stay here and live in the city. So that's something that I apologize if that hasn't, come across, but that's certainly a direct kind of need that we're hoping to address here. And I think maybe it just kind of gets, kind of referred to in a way that doesn't necessarily capture the real kind of place that that's coming from. And, we start talking in these, jargon at a certain point. So I think that's a good reminder to kind of just continue to take it back to that place to remind folks of why we're here in the first place.
I mean, I'm sure all this is going to help, but it takes forever. And you gotta put a lot of, you have to rely on so many different things to make it all work. And I don't know, it's just kind of depressing.
Yeah, it's all the stuff that we're talking about is the type of thing that, it would be a lot of this stuff at least is kind of longer term. Even, the tax exemption that was implemented or adopted earlier this year, it might take some time for residents living in those places to kind of, reap the rewards of that. So I think that's kind of something to think about, though, that this does happen over time. This is something that does slowly kind of happen. That's not just a big flood all at once, but we're kind of setting up, 6 to 8 years of projects that we hope to advance, at least, policies and programs that will address these needs. John.
Well, one of the things that I think we should look at as a part of an overall strategy is the impact of Airbnb and VRBO rentals in our neighborhood, and how much permanent housing that's taking out of the community, and what that's doing then to the remaining housing, and how expensive it is. And it seems to me that ought to be, I'm not sure I have a recommendation for that, but they ought to be looking at that to see if there's a real impact on affordability in our community.
I appreciate that input, John. Jessica, I guess I will say we have been tracking the number of, we do track these types of things within the city, and I don't think we have a huge amount of vacation rentals here in the city, but I don't know if Jessica, you have anything to share right now, but I will say that is something that is on our radar, and that we have, policies to prevent that sort of, at least certain abilities to kind of maybe abuse incentives that are offered by the city for those types of short-term rentals. So we at least have policies to try to preclude that.
Well, I apologize. This is Jessica. I stepped away just for a second, helping my son assemble a telescope while I'm listening. So I missed part of it. But in regards to short-term rentals, I do not have a number that I can give you. It's always a snapshot in time, because some of them are active and some of them are listed on these platforms but are not currently active. So it just depends on a snapshot in time. So we'd have to like basically what we do call a scrub, where we have a company that we pay to look at all the platform websites to tell us, you know, how many short-term rentals there are in the city, because there are some, unfortunately, that are operating probably without business licenses. And then, of course, we can look up our business licenses, but I don't have a number that I can share with folks today, unfortunately. My apologies.
Thanks, Jessica. Sorry to put you on the spot there. I guess the point is we do track this to a degree, and I think that's something that we do formally through business licenses and try to get at in other ways as well, because you are required to meet city sort of code. You are required to register your short-term rental as a home-based business, home occupation. So that's something that we do generally require for those, and that allows us to track them. But as Jessica mentioned, it doesn't necessarily capture everything. But I agree, and I think if we could get you a little bit more of a sense of the extent to which we think that this might be impacting the housing stock in the city, I think that would be good to look into. Yeah, I think Joe, the mayor made a good point here. We don't allow people to operate short-term rentals in their investment properties. It has to be their primary residence. That's one thing that I would point out. And just echo there. Yoko had a comment here. She said the affordable housing system is good, and I wonder how people who get into the affordable housing can motivate to work more and get over the income limit. Thank you. So yeah, I think that's something that I think maybe we provide some data that we often see that those incomes increase. I think Phil, I believe it was Phil, was talking about that a little bit before, how there are a lot of times when these exemptions are offered, if they go away, there is often sort of an income sort of increase that happens over time for folks that are able to benefit from this. But I don't have any like specific stats necessarily here, but I think generally it seems like your point is there, we should be considering potentially anything to incentivize potentially, folks to have that sort of income mobility, and that there could be some strategies that could particularly sort of address that specifically. Brendan?
Thanks, Eric. On that point, I just wanted to point out that most affordable housing that's being built these days with tax credits and so on is really set at a level where the people are likely working. If you have a tax credit project set at 60% of AMI, those are people who may be in the service industry, maybe in some lower wage type of blue collar work, but these are generally folks who are working. Only the HUD programs tend to serve people who truly may be unable to work at the lowest income levels. So just to that point, I want to make sure that when we talk about all these affordable housing programs and the different ways they're funded, that people understand that we're talking about civil servants, we're talking about people in the service industry, we're talking about people who generally are working, but our housing costs have risen to a level where it's difficult for some of those people to afford housing even while employed.
Thanks, Brendan. I think that's, again, good to remind ourselves of that this is that even folks that are working multiple jobs have a really difficult time sort of making rent in a place like Oswego. So obviously we do want to promote that sort of advancement of income, for folks to increase their level of income to the fullest extent possible. But really, that's what we're trying to address, is that need for housing and to get people housed. And that's kind of a sort of more acute sort of thing that we're concerned about with this work. Not to say that the other, issue is not necessarily important, but I think what we're seeing is that it's not a lack of sort of willingness to work that is the issue with affordability and being able to afford homes. Well, I think that, I think I want to leave it open for a little bit longer, but um, I think we've heard from a lot of folks here. We've heard a little bit from most of you that are here. Um, and yeah, I think this is kind of intending to be sort of just like an opportunity for folks to weigh in on things that haven't been addressed or that they think need to be addressed further. So that's really good for us to incorporate and think about. Yeah, it's very helpful. I appreciate you providing that insight with us, or yeah, providing us with that insight. So I will mention, I think, I haven't structured exactly how this is going to work, but I would like, obviously this is our last meeting. I will remind folks this is the last meeting of the task force. So that doesn't mean that we necessarily won't be working with each other in the future. But I think I just wanted to point out though that this is kind of where the formal kind of meetings will end, at least for the task force, where we'll have be working on this project. So it is a notable kind of milestone there, but I do want to just put it out there that this is a lot of work. We've identified a lot of strategies that we would like to advance moving forward, and we don't want to sort of sever our relationship with you all. We'd really like to continue working with you on the implementation of those strategies, and think about potential ways to include folks as kind of a sort of a voice that was involved in this process that could help sort of inform that any of those strategies. So we have about 15 that we've included in our report. So just think about if any of those are of particular interest to you, that you feel passionate about, that you'd like to kind of remain involved with. We would love that, and would love to have you kind of involved in some way moving forward with individual strategies, I suppose. So just think about that and let me know if you have any interest. I don't know if there are other slides, Kate, but I think should probably conclude the presentation.
Yeah, I think it's just our next steps.
All right, so I guess that's a good segue. So in terms of next steps, I mentioned that there will be a work session with the Planning Commission coming up on Monday, so the 24th. So we're going to be talking with them about very similar things that we talked to you about today. Really kind of just making sure folks are comfortable with where we landed with the HPS, and specifically with Pulte and MUPD and the pre-approved plan sets for ADUs. We'll be talking about those in a little bit more detail with them. So that will be this coming Monday on June 24th. We have a tentative study session with City Council planned for the 16th. So if we did kind of end up moving forward with that date, we would be discussing any kind of changes to what we discussed previously with them related to potentially Pulte or MUPD and those recommendations in the HPS. And then we have September 9th. It's kind of on the books for a Planning Commission public hearing, and then City Council public hearing on October 15th. Likely just one hearing would be needed, but we do expect that this could get adopted on the 5th of November, which would be, pretty, it would take effect on December 5th. So I think that's just, we have everything nice and kind of bundled up prior to the end of the year. And that would be kind of the formal end of this HPS process. So it's all kind of coming to its conclusion, but as I mentioned, there are a lot of ways to kind of continue to be involved, and we will definitely be reaching out to you for collaboration with work moving forward on those hearings in particular, and getting some representation from the task force to show up if we can. And I'm seeing a lot of kind notes in the chat. Thank you all for your work here. I think Yoko, it sounds like you're interested in potentially working with us moving forward on some of the strategies. And I think also I'd mentioned that Matt posted a link to Cole Peterson with some more information about accessory dwelling units and what they've been building in the Portland area primarily. So a lot that we can sort of learn from when it comes to typologies for ADUs that we could be implementing here in the city. Anyway, thanks again, everyone. Anything you want to say, Kate, Matt, Brendan?
I would just echo the thanks to everybody. And and I liked what Erik said a lot about keeping in touch. And if there's things, you've heard about during this process that you'd like to work on, that would be great to keep doing that. stay plugged in. So yeah,
Yeah,
otherwise,
I think
just thank you.
that continuity would be super cool. But yeah, it's all yeah, depending on your availability, and you've given us a lot so far. So again, thank you for that.
And I'll
Thanks
just
for all these
echo all that and just want to say thank you for all your very thoughtful comments.
Casey, you might have been trying to say something there. Sorry.
No. Just thanks for hosting all these and putting up with all our questions. Appreciate it.
I appreciate your continued interest and engagement, everyone. It's been great. Joe, appreciate your comments here as well. It's true. This is a lot of, this is really going to be, this is going to be like my manual of what I'm going to be working on for the next 6 to 8 years. And so this is of incredible significance to the city. But, I in particular can see how much work this will be and what a large body of work we produce. So I have a lot of appreciation and gratitude for you all. We will be in touch, and yeah, ideally, we can have some type of celebratory event when that is appropriate. And yeah, I will be reaching out to you about those hearings probably before then. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Enjoy your
Thank
weekend.
you.
Thanks.